Hi, this is Natalie Montijo, and this video is about elder abuse. Elder abuse is a very widespread and insidious problem in our society. And as mandated reporters, you have to know something about it, how to recognize it, what you need to do about it. And then as counselors, therapists, and perhaps eventually psychologists, you'll have to delve much deeper into the treatment of both the elder and perhaps the perpetrator, but that's for a different lecture. The insidious nature of this is deep. In our society, as many as maybe 1 in 10 elders have experienced abuse or will. Most of the abused, unfortunately, are female, and adult children and spouses are the most common perpetrators of abuse. The most common form of abuse is neglect. Elders can be vulnerable to unscrupulous people willing to take advantage of them. Mental and or physical ailments will make them more trying for the companions or people who live with them and care for them. In our country alone, more than 500,000 complaints of abuse against elderly Americans are reported every year. There are several different discrete forms that are recognized legally. Physical abuse is number one. Now, this not only includes physical assault, such as hitting or shoving, but also the inappropriate use of restraints, confinement, and what we call chemical restraints, which are drugs used essentially to restrain people. Emotional abuse includes intimidation through yelling or threats, humiliation and ridicule, habitual blaming and scapegoating, ignoring the person in your care, isolating the person with whom one is supposed to be caring, and menacing or threatening an elderly person. The third form is sexual abuse, and of course, sexual abuse can involve a physical sex act, but activities such as showing an elderly person pornographic material that they have no interest in seeing, forcing the person to watch a sex act, or forcing the elder to undress are also examples of sexual abuse. Neglect or abandonment by caregivers. Failing to fulfill a caretaking obligation constitutes more than half of the reported cases of elder abuse. It can be intentional or unintentional, and it can easily be based on factors such as ignorance or denial that an elderly person will need as much care as he or she does. And this is a situation that we encounter when discharging people from long-term care all the time. Not everyone, in fact, very few people are really certain, really in touch with how much care somebody who is exceedingly elderly, exceedingly frail, and especially somebody with dementia is going to require. As I tell family members who feel that they really need to do this, that it's very, very important. I tell them, in the nursing home, we have 3 shifts of people who do this work. And that's not something that we've been able to do with 1 shift. So sometimes it helps, but other times people do take the family member home, and oftentimes the family member will end up back in the ER in fairly short order. The next type of abuse is financial. Fiduciary exploitation. This will involve things like the unauthorized use of an elderly person's funds or property, either by a caregiver or by an outside scam artist. And Lord knows there are a lot of scam artists who simply target elderly people. Very, very bad and insidious problem. An unscrupulous caregiver could misuse an elderly person's checks, credit cards, or accounts. Caregivers have a lot of access. People who are in the home with a senior have access to checkbooks, credit cards, spare cash. So cash might be stolen. Household goods might be stolen. Perhaps this elder's signature would be forged on a check. And of course, identity theft is also very prevalent in our society. Typical rackets that target elders are announcements of a prize that the elderly person has won but must pay money to claim, phony charities, investment fraud. All these things are insidiously targeted at the seniors in our society. Healthcare, of course, has its share of abusers. Um, you'll see it with medical professionals of all types. Um, and this is more with the elders who are in the community. You might see healthcare services being charged for, but not obtained, overcharging, double billing. And then, of course, there's an entire, very dark underbelly of medicine that will happen, kickbacks for referrals to other providers or for prescribing certain drugs. And of course, there's a whole unscrupulous group of people who will recommend fraudulent remedies for all sorts of other things. And then there's the big, big area of Medicare and Medicaid fraud. So, how are we going to recognize elder abuse as mental health professionals? So, some of the signs are subtle and some of them are not so subtle. So, some of the signs and symptoms may look like dementia or just examples of a person's frailty. Or a caregiver may tell you that, oh, she's just that way. In fact, many of the signs and symptoms do overlap with symptoms of other forms of deterioration, mental and physical. But that doesn't mean that one should ever dismiss them just because a caregiver said so, especially if something in the situation just doesn't seem to add up. So, general signs of abuse are frequent arguments or tension noticed between the caregiver and the elderly person, and changes in personality or behavior in the elder. And you're going to look for things like a sudden withdrawal, especially if it's a person known to you or known to others. If this is somebody who's normally more animated, maybe this person is suddenly kind of withdrawn and pulling back and maybe appears to be afraid or more confused. If you suspect that there might be abuse, but you're not sure, look for clusters of some of these physical and behavioral signs. For physical, of course, you're going to look for very obvious things: bruises, welts, scars, especially if they're symmetrical on both sides of the body. But anything that cannot be readily explained bears looking into, or at least reporting to somebody who will look into it. If you're working, say, in a long-term care facility, you would find the director of nursing and you would ask him or her to do some checking. And by the way, any bruise which is not witnessed by someone, or skin tear, or any otherwise injury to the body that hasn't been witnessed by a member of the facility staff is investigated by the interdisciplinary team in long-term care. You're going to be looking for broken bones, sprains, dislocations, report of drug overdose or apparent failure to take medication regularly, broken eyeglasses or frames, and of course things like the signs of restraint, rope marks on the wrist. And of course, a cardinal sign would be any caregiver who refuses to allow you to see the elder alone. Emotional abuse. Other signs that you're going to look for are behaviors from the caregiver, like threatening, belittling, or controlling. Even subtle signs of that. And as mental health professionals, of course, you'll be trained to recognize the most subtle signs of these things. And behavior from an elder who is not as demented as they suddenly appear. If suddenly someone who was more with it, more oriented, is suddenly rocking, sucking his or her thumb, mumbling to him or herself. Anything pertaining to sexual abuse, of course, you might see bruises around breasts or genitals. And because I'm assuming that when you interview this person, they will probably be dressed. If somebody is favoring an area or touching an area around their genitals or breasts, and you might say, are you in pain there? Did something happen? And you can, of course, prompt a nurse or a doctor to investigate that. Unexplained venereal disease or genital infections, unexplained bleeding from the vagina or from the anus, torn, stained, bloody underclothing. Neglect. This is the big one. Unusual weight loss, malnutrition, and dehydration. And if you don't know how to recognize dehydration, one of the easiest ways to pick it up is look for a parched appearance. Does the person have very dry lips, dry skin? If you can see their tongue, is it kind of dry and cracked looking? There's a generally parched appearance. If you're speaking with somebody who has a catheter and you have a smell from that, or even if they have a brief on and you smell a very concentrated smell to the urine, that can indicate dehydration. It can also indicate a urinary tract infection, but you're looking, because you will not be investigating things from the physical standpoint. You're just going to look for general things, and then you will find the appropriate professional with whom to report it. Untreated physical problems are also manifestations of neglect. Bed sores, that's huge. And bed sores can develop very, very, very quickly under even, the um, uh, most careful sort of care. A person who is frail enough can still develop bed sores. So certainly somebody who is neglected will have probably some seriously significant bed sores. Unsanitary living conditions. If you're visiting in a home, is there an untidy, dirty appearance? Are there insects? Is there soiled bedding and clothes? Is there a smell to the room? Is the elder dirty, unbathed, unkempt, clearly in a gown or in clothing that they've had on for days? Do you smell feces? Is the clothing in which this person is clothed unsuitable for the weather? And you'll observe, of course, the condition of the home. Is there heat, running water, faulty electrical wiring, other kinds of hazards? And of course, there's even examples of people deserting their elderly charge in a public place. Financial, fiduciary exploitation. So in this situation, you might see significant withdrawal from the account belonging to an elderly person. A sudden unexplained change in this person's financial condition. Items or cash missing from this person's household. Suspicious changes in wills, power of attorney, titles, or policies. Addition of names to this person's signature card. Unpaid bills or lack of medical care, although the person in the caregiver's charge has enough resources to pay for these things. Financial activity that this person could not have done, such as an ATM withdrawal when the account holder is confined to bed. Unnecessary services, goods, or subscriptions. Healthcare fraud and abuse is something that you probably will not be seeing directly, but what does happen in some unscrupulous situations is that services are double billed. People can be over medicated or under medicated, and that's a big focus. Certainly in California, that's a big focus for the state in their oversight of long-term care. Use of medication as a restraint is a big problem, and it's something that facilities are being required to look at and to stop doing. It's relatively easy to give somebody, say, an antipsychotic medication if they are calling out or if they are in distress and cannot be otherwise redirected or comforted. But it doesn't mean that it's the correct approach. So these things are now being scrutinized, and rightly so. So, evidence of inadequate care when bills are paid in full. Again, we're still talking about the realm of healthcare fraud and abuse, and problems with the facility. I'm hoping that some of you will consider looking at working in long-term care. We need you, believe me. But if you walk into a facility and you'll be able to recognize pretty quickly if you are in a facility that's of quality or not. And by that, I don't mean if the building is, very modern, or if it's a beautiful place, because a lot of facilities were built some time back. Which you'll tell, how you'll be able to tell is how are the staff, how is the relationship between staff and residents? Do people look like they know what they're doing? Do the residents seem to be, as a group in the aggregate, okay and happy? Is the facility clean? Is there a smell? You'll be able to tell these things. But a lot of the times with care facilities, especially ones that are maybe sliding under the radar of the state body, um, who's supposed to provide oversight, you might find people who are poorly paid, or they might be insufficiently staffed. They might be too crowded. So these are things to look for. So how does an elder protect him or herself? You know, when you're working with people who are older, um, and you're helping them with various different problems, it is probably a very good idea to find a way to make sure to work into your relationship that they should make sure that as much as possible their financial and legal affairs are in order. Make sure that they have a good network of family and friends. People in our society often are isolated. The less we can do for ourselves, the more, unfortunately, in the United States, we're looked at as being useless. You know, it's a terrible, terrible thing. But it leads to a lot of isolation, and it leads to a lot of people ending up in the emergency room and then essentially losing their freedom when they need to become wards of the state. Encourage the seniors with whom you work to speak up if they need help, if they're in a care facility and something isn't going well, to tell someone that they trust. You all will be mandated reporters. And what that means is that if you either witness abuse or if you are told of abuse, you have the obligation to report this to the Adult Protective Services. If it's in the community, uh, you would be obligated to report it to the police if you witnessed an example of abuse. But Adult Protective must be informed in writing within 2 working days. If you are visiting a facility and somebody, an elderly person, tells you that they've been the victim of abuse, you must report that immediately to the ranking person in the facility. You can report it to the director of nursing. You can report it to the administrator. It must be reported. And then that person is obligated to report it to their state body within 24 hours. These are very, very important things. And even if you have absolutely no reason to believe that the claim has merit, you still have to report it, and it still has to be investigated. I wish you a wonderful time working with elders. It is very satisfying. It is great work. These are people who need us. And again, I hope to see some of you in the arena of long-term care.